everyone, welcome to another episode of Get Jashed. Today I have with me Christine Howard. Christine is a former registered nurse and midwife who then moved into the education sector, teaching nursing at Queensland University of Technology for 16 years. She has spent significant time as a national educator on 2 large palliative care projects, after which Christine was working with people in Indigenous communities, particularly in the Torres Strait. So now Christine is working for the Australian Digital Health Agency, an initiative tasked with improving health outcomes for all Australians, which I imagine must have been a busy time lately. But thank you so much for your time and for joining me, Christine.
You're welcome.
I'm very excited to talk to you. Yeah, we've had some amazing conversations and very, very interesting conversations about your experiences, which is why I reached out to see if you would be interested in joining me here for a conversation. So I'm very grateful. And you've had such a vast experience in that whole like nursing health kind of sector, not kind of actual sector, but with such different people and communities that you would have been connecting with. And I want to touch on, because I know this is an area of passion for you as well, I want to touch on your experience in communicating with the Indigenous communities and just get an understanding of your perspective of how leadership and communication sort of showed up there, either for you or if there was a particular element of it that you noticed that was very...
I'd say the leadership on their end that I've noticed, more than definitely, leadership for me. But I would say the biggest thing is that it's not about, it was quite different to anything I've done before. One of the key things is that working with people in Torres, the communities, or at Charleville, Cunnamulla, wherever, is that you go in and listen. And it's really, I can't believe how much, I was surprised at how much I learned from them. And I don't actually think it's the other way around. I think that people go in thinking, we're going to teach people how to do something this way, or teach people how to do something that way. But you end up learning so much from them. And it's just, I think we do things in different ways, but not necessarily one way might be better than the other as such. Makes sense. And leadership, so some of the leadership I've seen, very strong women, I would say, in the communities, in all the communities, regardless of whether that's been Cherbourg, Cunnamulla or Torres, very, very strong women. And then a couple of really strong male counsellors in particular in Torres, who I got to know. And I'd say one in particular who I think his leadership for a young fellow, and I say young in his 40s, really shone through a lot.
Is there particular qualities or traits in that leadership that stood out to you? And
I'll say for the one, his name's Laurie, and I'll talk about him. So he's the counsellor of Bardu. And I think one of the things that I'm watching him in his community, and so especially going out with him and his family and his wife, his partner and children, is but watching him on a whole when he's working with community is trying really hard to maintain their sense of culture, which is very, very different to here. Their culture, their language, doing it in traditional ways, but incorporating in some of non-traditional ways, because of the fact that, as he would say, times are changing, and so there's things that are changing where they still need to bring into the economy. And one of the biggest things is that, not just he'll say, but any of the communities, is that people want work. Is that everyone wants work, but they want meaningful work. They want work where it's necessarily, here it's, go and do this, so you've therefore got a job. They want actually something that's where they're going to learn from it, where it's going to be meaningful, where they're going to give back to the community. And so to be able to do that, to watch him try to build up that community it's like walking a tightrope. You see him walking that tightrope of trying to actually keep cultural ways, but by bringing it up into this century as well.
What did you learn about your own style of communication or leadership in that experience?
Probably is that I do in the past, if anyone that knew me well, is that I'll probably tend to take control of that conversation, earlier, or I'll be the one that would lead it. So I'd always be the one, because I was used to lecturing for so many years and coordinating big groups and then being the national educator is that was my role for a big part, was to actually lead the conversations and lead where it was going to go to, and do all the talking. And it was actually really hard to not be the person who leads it and not be the person who is the main communicator, but to actually just maybe put forward an idea or a question, but then just sit back and listen. Where I don't know that everybody does it, but certainly I have, was that I'd ask a question, but then you might actually sort of like guide how that's going to go. Well, you can't do that. It's really just a matter of, so my leadership, I think, changed very much in the way that it was, is that I had questions that I needed to get to, or things that I needed to do. And so I guess it was changed even more to advocating for people rather than actually leading people, I think would be a better way of saying it.
Yeah. And do you find that you have brought in some of that, like those new qualities in how you communicate or lead or advocate rather into your work, like back here? Yeah.
Oh, that's a hard one, just because my work changes so much all the time.
And it's very different, like different people that you interact with as well. So I'm just curious if it plays a role, or if it plays a service in that, or if it's too.
They're definitely qualities that I would like to take forward. I'd say that would be a good way of putting it. Because, and also working with the agency where I'm working now, because since COVID-19, there's just been huge, big priorities where it's been working very fast paced, a lot of work in a short period of time. And so it's been quite different altogether. But definitely the things that I've learned from working with communities is that there are ways that I'm going to do things differently in the future. And certainly for education, so education is something I know quite well, is that let's say that everything I've done for, well, it was 16 years plus another 6, so really 22 years of teaching. I would say that everything that I knew as an educator, so both through theory, so what I'd learnt, as well as through practice, is that to go to communities, you can literally throw it all up in the air, let it all land down the ground, pick out a few things, and then that will work. And so as a leader, as an educator, is that, again, where I would go in and I would teach and say, this is what you need to know, this is the way you're going to know it, learn it, and whether that be through lectures or through face-to-face or through written word or however it's going to be done, is that was all completely different. So none of that worked either, because there's cultural protocols and cultural reasons as to why things don't work. For an example, I'll give you, I don't know, this isn't quite leadership, but it will sort of give you an idea as to how I think we have to change things, or for me, it'll be changing things going forward. Is that, say that it was going in and teaching a community, and I wouldn't be doing this because, well, actually, all right, let's say sexual health for women. But certainly sexual health for both men and women is an issue everywhere. But just to give that an example as communities, is that if you were here, you might put up flyers in the health service and you might say, okay, well, we're going to give an education session about what you need to learn. And so getting people to then come in, and so whether you'd actually do that online or whether you do that in face-to-face. But people, if you do that, nobody's going to come, because small communities in particular, one of the things is that, is that one thing is nobody else wants everybody else's to know what business is happening. And so everything's done just like a lot quieter, a lot slower. There's a lot more about, well, here, this is the information you need to know. Very definitely being culturally appropriate, whether it's a male and it's a man that's going to give that information. So even the leader it's probably more working out who is actually going to be best to do that, who's going to be best to manage it. And then as a leader, it would be getting that person to actually do it rather than actually always be me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
It's not appropriate for me to do it.
Yeah, it's a much more considered approach with like sensitivities to leadership and how they choose to communicate things, even health initiatives. That kind of, to me, it does show that sensitivity, and it does show that sense of wanting to make sure that people feel comfortable so that they can then receive the information that they need.
Yeah, it's more about how they learn rather than what I teach.
Yeah, exactly. And when you said the bit about just throwing everything up in the air and like letting it land and then picking a few things out, it made me think of like there can't be that dogmatic approach to how we do communicate or lead, because you hit the nail on the head. It's exactly about how do people learn? How do these people hear things? And when we as humans hear things so differently because of our cultural background or because of our experience or our upbringing and all of these informing things on how we understand the world, it shows even more, to me at least, that there's not one set way that we can do things. It's
and I think not making, and I think any leadership or anything to do with management is that not making a presumption that you know what the other person needs. And so whether that be a team or whether that be the target audience or who you're actually working with, it's actually taking that time first to find out who they are, what is important to them, which is the other big thing, is that what I might see as being important isn't necessarily, because they're the things that is important, is such as, like, say you go to Torres and we might be saying, okay, well, this is important to do with health or whatever, and I don't want to give it an example because there's just too many things that are important. But they say their priority at the moment is environmental changes and sea rising water. Well, that is their biggest priority, or one of their biggest priority at the moment. And so it's very hard to say, if they've got a certain amount of time to be doing things, is that it's just hard to then actually go in and say, well, we see this as a priority. Well, I'm not listening to them and actually finding out, well, what do they see as a priority, which is quite different to, what it might be here.
Well. Just put in an element that has come up in a lot of these, like in these interviews a lot, is how, like, that communication, that effective leadership and communication really is about asking questions and actually listening. So rather than going in with this almost agenda, if you will, of
well, that's right,
to learn and this is how and la la la, and
exactly.
It's asking questions and it's actually trying to understand them, so that way you can help guide them. And maybe this thing over here is still very important, but you have to meet them and hear them and understand them a little bit more before you can try to.
And I think that's with any team or anything as well, is that you might have priorities, but until you actually take the time to stop and to listen and to work out what that team wants or what they've seen in the past and what has worked and what hasn't worked and why it hasn't worked, is that too, I think, is an important part of it as well. But
it sounds like that there's a lot more of that realization in that period of time in working with the Indigenous communities than maybe even over like 16 years of education.
Definitely. I learnt a lot in a very short period of time.
Awesome. Yeah. So I want to bring it back a little again, back to like more of your formative years, and just what was your understanding of what good leadership and communication was, or what it was in itself back when you first really understood them as concepts?
I have been thinking about that since I watched a couple of your other videos, and certainly as to what different responses that people gave. And for me, so I trained in the old school way of nursing, where it wasn't through university. It was at 17, working at a very busy, large public hospital. And you just kind of got trampled. It's so different to what it is now, thank goodness, is that, it was hard. It was really, really tough. And it was very dogmatic. It was very much like, as the bottom of the rung of the nurse would stand out before you got into the lift, and the third year nurse would get in front, it'd be, it would always be the doctor first, and then it would be the registered nurse, and then it was very, very, like, very, very much that way. And but so the leaders that I had then were pretty well all females. Well, there'd be very few males. They were all women, and they were tough. And I think they were really tough. And I think they had to be tough to actually survive that world in a certain extent, is to be a woman and to be listened to, and who they had incredible wealth of knowledge, but to actually stand up enough that people were going to listen to them and their knowledge to get to the positions they were in. I would say they were tough. And but it was sometimes it was some of the toughest women who I liked the most. And it wasn't whether they were tough or not, it was whether they were very straightforward and upfront and they said what they thought. I actually preferred those people than people who would sort of say one thing and then be a bit different. It might be quite sweet, nice to your face, but then not necessarily, I couldn't actually see where the ground lay. Yeah. I actually preferred those those
At
old
least
clinical nurses who were,
yeah.
the nurses in charge who were tough, but I actually kind of felt quite comfortable in that and quite familiar in that. And then going into universities, well, really, because it was a university in nursing, it was the same where, again, they were really quite tough. I think the women were very, very strong women to be who they were. Now, skip forward to the agency that I'm at now, and the CEO is an interim CEO, and she's amazing. Like, she's, really quite incredible and very relatable to people. And yet, to me, she is the polar opposite to the leaders that I'd had for all those many, many years. And I feel like I've just been watching her from this distance and just watching her and smiling all the time, because I think she's proving that you don't have to be that. Certainly, yes, you need to be firm and you need to be consistent, and I think it's what I've always liked is that people know where I like to know where I stand from leaders. I like to know what's expected of me early, and I think so certainly then when I was coordinating large lots of students, it was always important to me that right at the very first week is that I'd say, this is what I expect of you. I expect you to do this, and feel free to tell me what you expect of me too, and I'll follow it. And it used to be funny that I'd have a student, then would write in my, sort of like the end of year student satisfaction scores, as they'd say, oh, she was so sort of tough at the beginning, but then she softened and she became nicer. But I think that was that whole like being knowing what to expect. But watching the CEO now is that, she shows her vulnerability and her sense of humour, and but at the same time she's still leading, and I just think that's incredible, and I really quite love that.
Yeah, that's one thing that came up by the time this one comes out, last week's interview, is how vulnerability plays a huge role in leadership. It needs to. It's so important because it allows for that connection point, and it allows for people to understand what they're following or what they're being led by as well. And yeah, it's just
so. Yeah, and I guess both the leadership now and from what was earlier from my, like from when I was 17, 18, is it's having clear guidelines and clear messages, but showing that the way you can deliver them can be quite different.
Yeah, that's awesome. So this is one I ask most guests as well, just because I'm really curious, and I feel like it's important to identify these things for ourselves so that we can do them more on purpose. So with leadership and or communication, where do you feel like you get it right? Like, even if it's not a whole concept, but where do you feel like you generally land on it pretty well?
By telling people what, I think it would be telling people what I expect of them and listening to what they expect of me, and giving that give and take. And I'd say communicating is a big deal for me, and it is an important part of it. And I think without and plus having respect, like, having respect for the team or the people who you're working with, I think that's a really key part. But yes, I'd say some of those is some of my strengths, I guess.
Excellent. And likewise, because I also feel like it's important for us to allow ourselves to know that we're always works of improvement. Where do you feel like there's room for improvement for you personally?
I think one of the things that I struggled with the most, and what it worried me for the last couple of years as to how to cope, is that while I like people to be straightforward, I don't particularly like anger, and I don't particularly like I like in politics, like the whole putting, that sort of meaningless bickering I can't bear. But yeah, is that how I would respond, and I do wonder about it, as if then I would like to actually go further in leadership, but I don't know, is to see, I think what I'd worry about is that if I'm putting forward a strong stance on something, is that regardless of the space that you're in, there's always going to be somebody who's unhappy. And so I think that's something I've been working on personally, and that's something I've talked about too, I think, is that over that sort of last 6 months to 12 months is getting this space that I don't have to please everybody. Is there's going to be people who, and I don't say angry, I don't think that is the right word. It's more is that I don't have to please everybody, is that there's going to be people who are going to be unhappy and there's going to be people who are happy.
Yeah.
And I think coming to a space where you're comfortable that what I'm doing is is values that I see as important, not just to me, but for the people around me, or, you know, further to humanity even. And so what I see as being, well, what not only I see, but it is important, it is making a difference, then it's those other voices just I'll have to learn to put them into the background. And I think that's
and it's the balance of is learning to be okay with the fact that that might happen.
Yeah,
I can relate. I get it.
Yeah, and not take it personally, as that it's just to get to a point where it's just like, well, that's your opinion, and you're welcome to that opinion. And
yeah, and I'm doing like my work in my integrity, so this is what I can do. Yeah, I get that. And one more. So where do you feel like there is room for improvement in your industry? I mean, you can pick whichever aspect of your industry you want to speak to, or in the world.
I think that if we're still, because we had talked about Indigenous before, and I don't want to say it's Indigenous from my agency, because I think the agency that I've been working from really has been quite good at listening. But yeah, again, I think that conversation we had before is what I think on the bigger picture, and whether that agency, government, you know, whoever that is that if you're actually going in to say, okay, well, communities, and whether that be Indigenous or other cultures, or just community, as in whether that be a community of people or a community of whether you're fitness or whatever, instead of somebody coming in and saying, this is what we see you need, this is how we're going to make the yoga industry better, but we're going to give you, put these different things, we're going to say you must do this, you must do that, is that it doesn't work. You have to actually go in and just listen first and say, what can we do to work with you rather than for you or to you. But I think that is that what I'd like to still just keep going. Like, it is a strength that I think is good in my agency, but I think it can always be improved.
Yeah,
it can always be improved, is to always actually, let's say, is like, how are we going to work together on this? How can I work with you to make the improvements that you see that needs to be made?
Yeah, awesome. I love that. I think that's a really good improvement in general for all, of just listening and
Humanity.
engaging with a little bit more and communicating in a different way based on like just hearing people.
Yeah.
Even on a personal level, I think hearing each other makes a huge difference in how that then goes. So
it does. And then I think that's when the leadership comes in, though, is knowing what to do with that information. Is so that being able to go and listen to what somebody says, and then being able to problem solve with them, and then actually say, well, this is how we're going to, there's some suggestions of how we can move forward with this. And then having not only ideas, but being able to put those ideas into place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love our chats. It's always about just bettering the world, and it makes me feel all like, yes, let's do it.
I know. I just want to get out and do it now, though.
Yeah. So thank you so much. Thanks so much for joining me today, Christine. I really, really appreciate your time and your energy and your wisdom, as always. So yeah.
Hopefully we'll see each other in person one day again.
I'm sure we will. One day.